Hey guys, John from Untitled Tackle, and I'm back to finally deliver on a vlog that I said I would do well over a year ago now, and that's how to stick bait for GTs. I found it really tricky to pull together from the point of view of getting the ideal footage around rod work and what the lure's doing in the water, and I've got a few little pieces that I'm going to cut in here that I hope are helpful. I hope they give you a visual as well as the words, but I think the main thing is actually a description on how I approach it, and what I do is probably actually the most important thing to this little tutorial. So with stick baiting, there's really two styles. Floating stick baits on top, which is really the purest game. It's the most satisfying part of GT popping for me, is getting a good top water bite as opposed to a sinking stick bait, which is not visual. Generally the hit comes well subsurface. Trust me, the hookups are welcome, but they just don't have that same level of visual intensity that I love about top water. That's why I do top water. Not going to knock it though, because sometimes it's like the only way to get a bite. Sometimes G's won't rise to the surface, and sinking a lure down to the depths is the way to get a bite. It's also legitimate in that when the conditions just aren't right for floating stick baits, that a sinker is like the legitimate technique, because sometimes it's just not suited to floating lures at all. And a number of factors come into that, which we'll go into in a bit of detail. Okay, the first thing I'm going to cover is actually the gear you use to work a stick bait. And I think it is one of the most misunderstood and underrated aspects of stick baiting is the rod. There are specialist stick bait rods. There are popping rods, which aren't suited to stick baits at all, unless you're talking about massive, 250 gammas or something like that. And there are multi-purpose all-rounder rods. And how do you recognize which is which? For the most part, a manufacturer might tell us in their specs that it's designed for stick baits or poppers. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes the designation isn't there, and it's you're relying on perhaps the person selling it, or even better, perhaps knowing yourself what makes a popping rod and what makes a stick bait rod suitable for stick baits. The reality is it's probably two factors. One is the length. Generally, stick bait rods are a tad longer than the popping rod. Popping rods can be down as short as 7'6" quite often, and they're generally more stout and stiffer. We'll get to that. Stick bait rods kind of start at the high 7'11" perhaps, maybe a tad shorter in some brands, right up to 8'3", 8'4". They can actually be quite long sticks. The main reason why stick bait rods are actually longer is to provide a longer sweep, a longer platform for that lure to get in, dive, do its enticing weave before it pops up. With popping rods, you can't make them super long. They're physically too hard to work, and they become absolute broomsticks. So that isn't applicable with stick bait rods, because they're actually easy and gentle to work. So a bit of extra length works in our favour. Aside from length, there is that softness in the blank, and I'm going to show you 3 rods here to try and demonstrate how you can pick up yourself what's a popping rod, what's a stick bait rod. I'm going to start with this blank here, which is an ASWB soda, which is a dedicated popping rod. It's relatively short. I've got a Stella 18 hanging off the back of it, which would probably be the most common reel anyone would use with this outfit. And I'm going to go ahead and put one hand right behind the stripper guide and one hand on the tip. And hopefully you can pick that up there. It's where I'm balancing the rod and the stripper guide. See how little that rod actually bends through there. It's probably a little bit easier against the white. There's not a lot of bend. There's a lot of stoutness and rigidity to this rod. And that's necessary to work a big chugger, I can tell you. Refer back to the earlier GT popping tutorial on working a popper, and I'll talk a bit more about that. I'll move from a dedicated popping rod, which does a very poor job of working a stick bait. I'll bring you to what I consider to be an intermediate style all-rounder rod. It's a Carpenter Monster Hunter 80H. It's a custom. I'll perform the same kind of test, hand behind the stripper guide, one hand on the tip, and you'll start to see a little bit more of a progressive curve through that rod. Hopefully you can see that at the tip. It's got a little bit more life in it, not a stack, but a little bit more life in it than the dedicated popping rod. That will do a pretty good job of working a popper or a stick bait, but it won't do the perfect job. It sits somewhere in the middle. So it's kind of like perfect rod to take as a backup to a dedicated popping and a dedicated stick bait rod, or if you've only got the coin for one rod, it's a good option. I'll take you now to what I consider to be a dedicated stick bait rod. It's another ASWB, the Indian Pacific GT Tamer, and this is the P8 rod. It's longer, it's well over 8 foot. Hand behind the stripper guide, hand on the tip, and you'll see now there's actually quite a bit of softness through the top half of this blank. There's a stack of backbone to fight a fish, but now there's a softness through the top half, and that softness really aids when you're working a stick bait with the action of pulling that lure into the water and beginning the swimming process. My general experience with working floating stick baits is if your rod's too stiff, your lure's here at rest, you start to sweep, you get a much more violent jerk at the toe point, and the lure very often just pulls and skips out of the water and gets towed along the surface and doesn't swim. Doesn't mean you won't get a bite, but the lure's not doing what it's meant to do. That softness of a dedicated stick bait rod combined with proper rod technique will pretty much ensure that that lure tip pulls into the water, under, and then starts to swim. It'll swim through the surface and then subsurface. That's the general action of most floating stick baits. So that's it on rod selection. Yes, invest in a specialist stick bait rod if you've got the coin. If not, go for an intermediate rod. If you're only going to have one outfit, go for that general purpose type rod. For me, I use a Stellar 18 on my dedicated popping outfits. On my dedicated stick baiting outfits, I actually like to use a Stellar 14 with a aftermarket spool, and it's just a small thing for me. It doesn't really matter, but I like a tiny bit more of a compact feel, a slightly lighter feel, a bit more of a nimble feel. Working a stick bait is a finesse situation. Working a popper is grunt. Ugh. So I go for a bit more of a finesse approach, and I like the slightly smaller reel. Trust me, 16,000 spool. I've gotten low online before in a land-based situation. I'm gonna get spooled here. But from a boat, I've never had a scenario where I've gotten that low that it's critical. It holds plenty of PE10. It's a bit disconcerting that when you do a cast, half the line's off the reel. But trust me, GTs don't run that far. If you're running the drag that you should be running, you know, anywhere north of 10 kilos, 12 kilos, if you're a brute, more than that, your chances of getting spooled, in my humble opinion, are really low. Okay, so we've got floating sticks and sinking sticks. Floating sticks are where it's at for me. I like working them the most. Here's a few of my favorites. Just random selections, guys. Really underrated. The Adek Dancer series. Amagari Flavi. Amagari Kaksu. Jackfin Argo. And Blazeburn. That's not a comprehensive list. There's others. but they're a few of my favourites. So we'll deal with floating stick baits first. They're designed to swim along and through the surface, like I said, and you know, they go through, depending on the lure shape and design and the weighting, they'll go from this nose up position, because the weight's always in the tail, and they'll dive into the water and they'll swim and slash and roll and dive before they then come back up and rest when you've gone to the end of your sweep. How do you get that action? Well, fire out your cast, point the rod tip above the lure and sweep it down to the side to a low rod tip position. That's probably the standard move, is a sweep. You begin the sweep with the smallest amount of slack line. If you haven't got slack line, the lure tip is already getting pulled down, and from that position, when you start to pull, the lure tends to just go through the surface or over the surface. You want a tiny bit of a belly in the line, and it's minute. So you wind up the slack, you just give it that little bit of slack and sweep down. And it's a repetitive motion. Sweep, wind, sweep, wind. So the lure's cutting through, stops, just bobs up before you start to sweep again. Don't panic too much if the lure's sitting there for a second or so. GT's hit stationary lures plenty of times. Often it's seen as that moment to actually attack, so don't stress one little bit, but you try and get into a cadence of sweep and wind, and that might be depending on where the current is or the wind is or where you want to cast, or other anglers, you might end up sweeping backhand. And it's a lot easier doing it with a stick bait than it is with a popper, I can tell you, working backhand. It works a real small part of your anterior deltoid, whereas working forehand, you've got your whole chest, your back muscles, you can engage your core, and you're even using your legs. It's so much easier. This is a short-term action going backhand. So many factors influence how you sweep the lure. Current plays a huge part. If the lure's going with the current, you might need to sweep a lot faster and harder. You might actually need to tug the lure into the water a little bit initially to get it down. It's already got some forward momentum and you need to work things faster. Or if you might be casting down current, you might need to do things a whole lot gentler and really super slow and almost be like painfully slow. Cross current make lures do crazy things, often make them not swim properly, and that's a time where the sinking stick bait can be more appealing. So bear that in mind, that every cast you make, no retrieve will be the same. So you can practice all you like, one style, the actual fishing conditions will dictate what you're going to do on the day. So be a student of the game. Watch what happens to your lure, watch what's working, watch what the changes do, and just have that in your mind that every cast is different, every retrieve is different, no two are the same. You shouldn't be, if you're working a floating stick bait, you should be doing nothing other than watching that lure in the water, not just to witness the awesome strike, but so you can actually be the angler and react and fish properly to that lure. It requires your full attention. Wind. Wind affects us for the same reasons that I spoke about with current, but there's probably an even added factor is the belly that you get in the line. Fishing, P8, P10, you get a big belly between your rod tip and the lure, and that has to be taken into account because often that will pull the lure sideways to begin with. So you've got a big belly in the line pulling it that way, the lure is no longer sitting like this, the lure might start to do this and pull that way, and you're trying to then pull it across here. All tricky factors, all things that I can't accurately explain to you what you need to do now, other than you need to be aware of it and modify your retrieve to suit that. Boat positioning matters, what you do matters. If it all gets too hard, that's when you go to a sinking stick bait, and we'll get onto that in a minute. But for the most part, pretty bad conditions can be fished with a floating stick bait if you know what you're doing, if you've got the hooks right, and we'll talk about hooks at the end. It's all down to learning that part of the game. The third factor I want to talk to you about with floating stick baits in particular that really affect us are your position above the water. If you're in a small center console, you're right there on the water, your rod tips you're sweeping down near the water. Pretty easy. You get up on elevated bows on, say, big game boats or some of the specialised popping rods, boats around the world. And you're very high. You're like, maybe 3 meters above the water. You get even higher again on land-based platforms. You'll find yourself working that technique, maybe bringing the rod down in actually under you to try and get the rod tip down. The issue you'll have with an elevated platform is keeping the lure in the water, because that line angle position is less like this to pull it forward and down. You're actually pulling it up, which can make it pretty tricky. It's not impossible. I favour in those times actually a slightly modified sweep. Got to have the slack at the start, but I'll actually give it a little bit of a tug at the initial to really overemphasize the pulling of the tip into the water, and then I'll actually slow down the sweep. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Play around with that one. Wind, current and elevation above the water are the biggest factors with your floating sticks. Master that, you can do anything in GT popping. Onto the sinking stick baits, which are the less pure aspect of GT topwater fishing, in my opinion. Is it really topwater? I think technically no, but hey, it's still lure casting, so it counts. You could be fishing anywhere with sinking sticks from literally just under the surface to many meters down. I've been in plenty of situations, different reefs, where we've given lures like a 30-second countdown. It's really popular in Hawaii. They dredge, basically, Carpenter Pandoras, which are super fast sinking lures to get down deep. So I'll just go through a few of my fave sinkers. Orion Bigfoot, Orion Plug Tropic, Orion GTX. As you see, Orion does pretty good sinking GT lures. The sinking version of the Amigari Flavi, and the Heru Wahoo, or if you want really fast sinking, the Heru Barbara. So they're just a few examples of the sinking GT lures that I like. For the most part, sinking GT lures will sink horizontally, not in a tail first manner. So they often get bit doing just that, doing their sinking. When to use them? When you know the fish are deep and they won't come up. When the conditions dictate that it is really super hard to work a floating lure. And that happens enough. When the conditions too windy, too rough, just can't get that thing to swim, elevated platform, whatever it might be, it's a good time to go to a sinking lure. As I said earlier, you can work these anywhere from just under the surface, which is like, pretty much, it's too rough for a floater, so I can go just subsurface and I can still be in the game, or to I'm going super deep and going to dredge off this corner, or off this reef, or this pressure point. They're a whole lot easier to work. There's a lot less skill involved in getting a sinking stick bait to do its thing. Essentially the same sweep I'm talking about, honestly the same sweep, but I would just do it slower. I would do it a whole lot slower, and they produce. It's probably where you should start as a GT angler, popping and sinking stick baits, and move on to the floating sticks when you get your game going strong. Sinking stick baits, by nature of the water damping, are a little bit less lively. It's just that the water slows down that action under the water. So it's a time when you can add little twitches and jerks and do different things to the lure to get it to come to life a little bit. So bear that in mind. You can't always see it, but you can just imagine what it's doing under there and try and give it, a little bit more realism by imparting some twitches and paws and jerks to the rod tip. All I've talked about so far is a sweeping action. There are 3 other types of stick bait retrieves that I commonly use. One is a scenario where I tuck the rod right up in under and I give a short, relatively fast twitch. And I'll tend to use this if the fish are active and my buddies are getting a bite, and maybe I want to have a bit of that action and pull a fish off their pack or whatever, or I'll just do it to mix it up. But essentially it's just the rod's across my body, I've cast straight out down that way, and it'll be a very much a bit of, I've got a NT swivel there banging on the rotor, a very jerky short motion using the reel with a overemphasized crank and a rip of the rod tip. Really brings the lure to life. The lure will sit somewhere between doing what a stick bait should, or being a pencil and skipping along the surface. It's really erratic, and I do that in a fast sense and also a relatively slow sense with a lot of pauses, a really jerky action, and that's often what I'll go to when the sweep isn't working. If it's not working because I'm not getting a bite, or it's not working because the conditions aren't allowing it. This kind of jerking action is a lot easier to get a simple result from. You can do it fast, you can do it slow. The third stick baiting method that I will use, and it's when it's tough. It's when you're casting for days on end, not getting a bite. I'll throw this in pretty often, and that's super fast burn, like skipping that stick bait across the lure like it's a pencil. Just, whatever you need to do, rod tip up, in the bucket, just crank, 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 or up under your arm, crank, 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 like this. I'll get it halfway back and I'll just stop it. Just let the lure sit. And then I might start to slowly wind it, and I might perhaps do some really slow sweeps after that back to the boat. What I'm actually trying to do then is turn on shut down fish, and I'm actually trying to imitate a flying fish that's done its flight and landed and then start to swim again. Because if you've ever watched what flying fish do, they're fast through the air, but when they land, it actually takes them a while to get sorted again and actually start swimming. And I've seen it a number of times when the bite's been really tough, that will raise interest when nothing else is working. So these little tricks in your bag are worth having. Final word on stick baiting for G's is your hook selection. For the sinking lures, I go really quite heavy and aggressive with my hooks. It's sinking anyway, and sometimes I can actually help that sink rate by going some really big singles. That tends to be my go-to for those. For floating stick baits, play around is my advice. The balance of a lure is a really critical thing in the conditions. If it's rough and I want to work a floating stick bait, I'll probably slightly overhook the lure. And this will actually allow me to be a little bit more aggressive on the sweep, allow that lure to hold in a little bit better. If you slightly overhook a floating stick bait and you go aggressive on it, what they tend to do is slash along the surface before they get traction. Like the hooks help them get traction, and then they'll dive under. And I think that adds some excitement to it too for the fish, in that there's white water, there's commotion, there's a bubble trail before the lure pulls in. So you won't get like firm advice from me of, oh, you must run these hooks on that lure because that's how it swims best. The hooks relate to the lure, relate to the conditions, and relate to what you're doing as the angler. So my advice is play around with it. Different hook combos for different folks is basically where I'm getting at there. It all comes down to what you're doing on the rod butt. So there it is, guys. There's my views on GT stick baiting in a short wrap up. I hope that helps. If you have any questions or about this topic or others, please whack them in the comments. You'll help inspire us to perhaps do some more tutorials and keep this content flowing. And do us a favor, hit us with a subscribe, help this channel along. Comments and likes all help, and give us some motivation to keep going. Now, if you need product advice, Andy's there working full-time at Ebbtide, so hit him up with an email, hit him up on the store. We've got live chat during business hours, and he'll help you make some sound selections. We are there to help, guys, not just sell fishing tackle.